Welcome to the ExecMBA podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'd like to share my recent conversation with Zoe Mayfield-Boykin. Zoe is a member of our professional degree admissions team here at the Darden School of Business, and she is a repeat guest on our admissions podcast. Zoe and I recently connected to talk about a really important topic, that is, how to approach your boss about doing a professional degree program. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. And as always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to the ExecMBA podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Zoe Mayfield-Boykin. Zoe, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
It's great to talk with you. Happy New Year. How's everything going?
Happy New Year. Looking forward to 2026 here.
I know, it still sounds futuristic to me. That has not changed.
Still futuristic.
Well, we already had a conversation about researching working professional programs. And, that's kind of the first step in this process. But if you're going to do a working professional program, ideally, you're starting to have conversations with people at work and at home about doing the program and what it could look like for you and for them, for you to take on this commitment. And so I thought it would be helpful for us to have a conversation here about, talking with your boss about doing a working professional program, an important conversation. So that sound okay to you?
Sounds great.
All right. So why is this conversation important?
Yeah, it's incredibly important because the decision, even considering the decision to return to school, that's a very big endeavor to take on. And it impacts not just you and your time and your life, but also the folks around you. And that includes the folks at work. And so naturally, when you embark on an MBA program or any professional degree program, your life and your time will become limited. And you're going to have to really strike a balance between your professional and personal life now with this introduction of academics.
Yeah, and it's going to be really important to have your supervisor or whoever manages your time. It's going to be really important to have their buy-in because there will be times where school will have to pull you away from your day-to-day obligations. Even in a program like our part-time MBA program, which is evening, weeknight based, there may be times where people would have to shift around a work trip or may have to leave a meeting early, or perhaps they can't go to some particular conference because they have class and it just doesn't work. So you really need their buy-in and need their support. I think from an admissions committee standpoint, this is one of the first conversations you should be having after you've researched. Invariably, it gives me heartburn when you sometimes are talking to people in the admissions process and you start to realize, oh, I'm not sure they've actually talked to their boss about this, because that doesn't go so well. When you're going to go through the whole admissions process, get a decision, and then go back, I think that's a very awkward conversation. So we're trying to set our applicants up for success here. Start these conversations early and often. Now, I will say that sometimes people feel like there's a risk with having a conversation with your boss. Sometimes you get a sense that people are kind of anxious about talking with their boss. Why do you think people might be anxious about this conversation?
I think the anxiety is probably maybe in two places. The first might be that there might be some underlying assumption that with an MBA, you're planning on leaving your role in your job. And that's not always the case. Maybe it's something you're thinking about down the road, but there's maybe some concern that there's professional risk there that could be driving some of the anxiety. I think the other piece is that we are asking for you to be transparent. We like for folks to set an expectation that both our in-person as well as our virtual courses that attendance is mandatory. And so sometimes that might mean stepping away from a big project or, departing work early, particularly in the case of executive MBA, those executive MBA weekends. And, sometimes asking to maybe step back a little bit can be anxiety producing for folks when having that conversation with the supervisor.
Yeah, I also think there's this thing where people sometimes are worried that they might get feedback like the person doesn't think that you need an MBA. And that is, I think that's tough to hear, particularly if it's a goal of yours, but it's a helpful information because it can sometimes tell you like, oh, what I think I can do here may be different than how this person thinks of what's possible for me. And better for me to know that now, like an MBA is still a goal of mine, but better for me to have some sense of how this person may be thinking about my role in the organization, my potential within the organization now. It's an awkward conversation for sure. Not to diminish that or downplay it, but that is nevertheless useful information for you as someone who is interested in advancing yourself in making this investment in yourself that an MBA is. And so I think people sometimes worry about like what the person might say, right? And so, you're never quite sure, but it's a good conversation to go ahead and get started. And I think one of the reasons why we encourage people to research upfront is because there's all kinds of questions that oftentimes will come from the manager, right? Like, what's the schedule look like? What's the time commitment look like? We talked a bit about it in your episode. How do you encourage people to sort of talk through? Okay, you're talking to this person about like the program schedule, a lot of information come their way. How do you encourage people to approach that?
I think it starts with some really solid research, doing the research on the front end on your own, understanding the differences between different programs, and that includes we mentioned this in the last episode, but that includes understanding things like the schedule of the program. When will you need to be in person? When will you be able to be online? Are you going to be 100% in person? What does that really look like? Also, thinking carefully about sort of the time commitment. What does the time commitment look like on a weekly basis for an executive or a part-time MBA student? The other thing that you might want to think about researching carefully is the length of time in which you might need to be away from your work. For us, our students do participate in week-long residencies. Each program has a touch point down in Charlottesville, one at the beginning of the program. For a part-time MBA, they return after 18 months to Charlottesville for another week-long residency. Executive MBA will return to Charlottesville for a week-long residency at the end of their program. And Executive MBA has a week-long global residency requirement that also takes some time away from work. And so really having an understanding of what that will look like on a day-to-day basis, week-to-week basis, maybe even in the entire length of the program can be very, very helpful. I also think it can be helpful to articulate when having this conversation with your supervisor what it is that you would like to accomplish out of this program. And that way they can be as supportive to you as they can, and they can understand sort of the entirety of your vision in wanting to pursue an MBA.
Yeah, I appreciate all of those points. It's a bit of a dance. I think when people are presenting all of this, I think the candidates are trying to minimize the sort of the impression like they're going to be gone forever. And I mean, honestly, the executive MBA, you think about the total class commitment over the 21 months of the program. We have two formats. We have an executive MBA format. We have a global executive MBA format. The only difference between these two formats is the number of global residencies required. As Zoe mentioned, the required global course, MBA format students required to do one. Gimba format students required to do four of these global residencies. And so it's 35 class days over the 21 months of the program for MBA format students. It's 50 class days over the 21 months of the program for Gimba format students. And so not a huge amount of time in the grand scheme of things. I mean, we've had students who've covered this with their PTO. But I think as you're talking with someone, you really want to make sure you're setting an expectation that allows you to get the full value out of the experience, right? And that's why we always encourage people to approach this conversation and when they're talking to their boss to say, to Zoe's earlier point, right? The weekend residencies are required. My expectation of the program is that I will be online for the online classes and treating these like very firm commitments because it's discussion-based participatory learning. You can watch a recording, but it's not quite the same as being there. And class participation is 35-40% of your grade in many of these courses. And, you want to create a reasonable expectation that allows you to get the full value out of the experience. And so being very clear about that and having a very solid understanding of the structure and design of the program, what's possible and it may and what may be more challenging is really important. And we can help with that. I feel like, Zoe, a lot of the conversations we end up having with prospective students are about some of the ins and outs and intricacies of the schedule.
That's right. We spend a lot of time in those one-on-one conversations that we offer, walking folks through those program through the program, the format of the program, the schedule, and things like that. But also through webinars that we host. We have webinars that run very frequently that cover all of these points about both part-time and executive MBA. And so all of these resources are available to you as you're preparing for those conversations.
So I'm curious, most people are probably thinking about an executive MBA or part-time MBA for maybe even a couple of years before they actually decide to apply. When's a good time to have this conversation with your supervisor?
I would say that a good time to have this conversation is actually during your research process. As you are thinking and considering pursuing an executive or part time MBA, I would include your supervisor in that part in that research and into the conversation early. Early and often, even if you don't go through with applying in that year, I think putting that on your supervisor's radar, like I said, early and often, is always appreciated. The time to not have that conversation is after you have submitted an application or after you have maybe received an admissions decision. Certainly, if that's the case, we want you to bring your supervisor up to speed. But the best time is early, often, and maybe while you're doing your research, including your supervisor into those conversations.
Yeah, I always tell folks, even if it means you have to slow down your application process to have this conversation, that's a delay worth pursuing. It's going to ultimately put you in a better position as an applicant. You're going to be able to approach your supervisor about being one of your recommenders potentially. It's going to allow you to have that peace of mind that I've kind of checked the boxes. I've been talking with all the right people about doing the program. And the nice thing about applying to executive MBA and part-time MBA programs, at least here at Darden, is that there's not one time when everybody applies. We have a deadline structure that accommodates this sort of diversity of timing. We meet great people in the fall, the winter, the spring, the summer, and we have deadlines that stretch basically from the fall all the way into the summer months. And so, know that you probably have time to slow down and have a conversation. And if you don't feel like you have that luxury of time, I would encourage you to Zoe's point, like figure out how you get some time with that person as quickly as you can, and try to catch them up to speed and sort of build that sort of support and consensus and kind of bring them along, because it's ultimately going to pay dividends for you down the road. So. Zoe, we talked about the importance of talking with your supervisor and also sort of, providing information, doing that research. What are some ways that candidates can demonstrate that they've had this conversation, that they've connected with their supervisor in the application process?
Yeah, you mentioned briefly earlier the recommendation. So, we require one recommendation. We'll accept up to two as part of our application process. And one of the ways in which you can demonstrate that you've had this conversation, and it's actually our preference, is that you secure a recommendation from your current supervisor. You know, this recommendation is actually not a letter; it's a form that your supervisor will fill out, as well as a ratings grid. And the form will ask three questions. We'll ask first, how do you know the candidate? Second, how does this candidate compare to their peers? And the third is that what is a piece of critical feedback that you've given this candidate? And so you can see how those three core questions really relate to someone who has seen you in a supervisory role. But not so beyond just having the supervisor, maybe complete the recommendation form. A really strong recommendation is somebody who reflects in that form all the things that you have been speaking with them about as to why you want to pursue this path for yourself academically, professionally, and all of that comes through in that letter. And so we can tell very quickly someone who has had a conversation with their supervisor versus maybe somebody who has left some of the key pieces out as to why they have decided to embark on this journey.
Yeah, when you think about what your supervisors can be asked, or their recommenders could be asked to do, I should probably say that. I mean, the first rule when it comes to picking a recommender is someone who knows you well. And ideally, to Zoe's point, it's your current supervisor, and that person knows you well, and you can demonstrate to the admissions committee by having that person be your recommender that you have had conversations with them about your interest in pursuing this program. Now, if your current supervisor doesn't know you particularly well, let's say it's a new role or a new supervisor, then choosing someone else makes sense. And if you choose someone other than your current supervisor, we always recommend using the additional comment section of the application to explain a little bit more around your recommender choice, because we give this advice around preference for current supervisor. And so if we don't see a current supervisor there's any number of things we can speculate on, anything that we can jump to all kinds of conclusions we can jump to, but you really don't want us to do that as the admissions committee. And so good use of the additional comment section is explaining recommender choice again if you ultimately opt for someone other than your current supervisor. But it's worth sort of acknowledging what your recommender is going to be asked to do. Completely electronic process. It consists of a ratings grid and then really four basic questions, three of which I think of as the meat of the recommendation process. How do you know the applicant? How does the applicant compare to their peers? And what's one piece of constructive feedback you shared with the applicant? The fourth question is anything else you'd like to share about the applicant. So those two questions, how do they compare to their peers? What's one piece of constructive feedback? You can see why supervisors are really well positioned to respond to the recommendation prompts and to be recommenders. And asking your current supervisor is just a very natural and easy way to signal to the admissions committee that you've been having these conversations, that you've gotten buy-in from people at work. And Zoe, I would love to believe that every supervisor is always supportive and 100% all in for people doing a working professional program. But unfortunately, it doesn't always go that way. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. If someone has a conversation with their supervisor, right? They're doing all the right things. They did their research. They got all the information together. They set up a conversation. They go to that conversation. They say, look, I'm really excited to do the executive MBA program at Darden. Here's the schedule. What do you think? And the person is unsupportive. How do you encourage candidates to navigate that?
I think you mentioned it earlier in this discussion. That's incredibly unfortunate when that is the case. We'd like to think that all of our candidate supervisors would be supportive, largely because when you're in an executive MBA program, you take what you learn, or a part-time MBA program, you take what you learn and immediately apply it to your job. It's not sort of delayed return on investment. You are immediately kind of getting better after each classroom session. But we recognize not every supervisor may see it that way. I think there's two routes that a candidate could go. One, it's helpful information. It's a helpful data point to understand maybe more of your professional landscape and kind of what you're navigating. And maybe it is a reason to maybe press pause on the application, and maybe things will change for you professionally, and maybe you'll work for somebody who is supportive, and that would be ideal. And so that's one route, right? That people will think about these programs for many years for many reasons, and that might be one of the reasons. The other thought I had is that, as you mentioned, Brett, amount of time away from work can very easily, for many folks, be covered by PTO, or paid time off. So that is a route that sometimes students will take, even if they don't have the support of a supervisor.
Yeah, I loved your point about sort of trying to reframe the conversation and say, look, here's how this is going to benefit um, us, and it's going to benefit our team and the employer generally. This is what I'm going to be learning. I'm going to be bringing back to work. And I think you started out with this point, and I think this is really important to acknowledge. Like, it's sometimes in the room when you say you want to do an MBA, some people will naturally assume that means that you're going to leave.
Mm.
And so it's a chance for you to say, look, I am here. I like to continue to grow here. Of course, if this is sincerely how you feel, I think that's an important thing. But like, it is a chance for you to say, this is all part of how I'd like to continue to grow and develop here. And here's the value that I feel like this experience is going to add to our organization, how it's going to make me a better employee. And we hear that. This sort of real-time ROI, I know, is something that people read about on websites for professional degree programs, but it's very much a real thing. There's a reason why we talk about it. It's because students, the way that you learn at Darden, it's case methods, application based. It's not a huge stretch to go from a case discussion to say, you know what, I think I have an idea how I can apply that at work, because you just spent 90 minutes thinking about how you apply this particular concept or tool or technique to solving a problem. Right? It's very easy to extrapolate in that way, and so I think it's important to reframe the conversation. If the person still is not supportive, I think sometimes these things can be cultural in organizations. If you look around and there's not a lot of MBAs, sometimes that can drive the conversation. Sometimes if that person has ultimately decided not to pursue an MBA, that can also be in the room at times. But I think this is where it's really important to be clear about what your goals are. And sometimes your learning goals differ from the goals an organization might have for you. And so then you need to be sort of very clear with yourself about how important an MBA is for you. And I think that's where the PTO conversation comes in. I think the folks who had to go that route, they were very clear that, look, I'm sorry for the way that conversation played out, but at the end of the day, this was a very important thing for me personally, and maybe an important thing for my family. I think we hear that a lot from candidates, where they're not just getting this MBA for themselves; they're thinking about their kids and demonstrating what's possible to their children, and maybe building more opportunities for their family. And there's a lot of things that are on the table beyond just that immediate conversation with your supervisor. Anything you would want to note along those lines?
No, I think you covered it.
All right. Well, I'm curious. Any other advice you would offer? Like, one thing that's been on my mind is we've been talking so much about work. What about home? Like, is there anything that you encourage candidates to think about when it comes to those home conversations?
Having those home conversations early and often is equally, if not more important. I would say our current students will tell you that, their folks in their personal lives, a spouse, a partner, their children, their families, are equally impacted by this endeavor to pursue an MBA. And so, making sure you are bringing those folks along with you in terms of the time commitment away from family, maybe time that you are maybe having to step away from, extracurricular activities that you normally attend with children, or time with a partner or spouse, is something to be very upfront about early. And also recognizing that maybe there are things that or commitments that you and your partner carry equally, or you carry more of that may end up landing more on your partner or spouse, and being very transparent upfront about that. Early and often, I think, is always the best, because the time to have that conversation, like I said, is before you are matriculate into one of our programs. It can be a little bit more challenging once you're in it.
Yeah, and I think so many of the things that we talked about here today also apply to that conversation, right? The self-reflection, understanding why you want to pursue this particular degree, how this fits into your particular vision for your career goals and where you'd like to take your career. Researching the program, understanding the time commitment, and sort of translating that to what it would mean for your availability at home. I think most of our students, almost all of our students, would tell you uh, there are things that they would normally do that have to be transferred to somebody else at their house as they go through the program. And they really lean on other people as they go through the program, not just at work, but also at home. So they view the degree as much as of a family accomplishment as anything, right? That may sound surprising, but it is very much a sort of, we're all doing this. Graduation is a time for us to celebrate all that we've accomplished together. It's not just the student. There's so many other people who are supporting the student, and sort of helping people understand how they can be supportive of you, how they could help you, and really helping them understand why it's important to you and the benefit that will come with it. The hardest thing I would say from an admission standpoint is to prepare people for the time commitment. So I always feel that when we talk with prospective students or admitted students in the summer, we say around 10 hours a week for part-time MBA students in terms of school-related commitments, maybe about 15 hours or so for executive MBA students. But that's an average. That's not every week. What do you tell people about the time commitment?
Yeah, what I like to share about the time commitment are those figures, anywhere, 10 hours on average to about 15 for our executive MBA students. But I think it's going to depend on a few things. I think it's going to depend on the quarter that you're in. It's going to depend on your comfort level with the material being taught. If it's maybe more quantitative heavy quarter and you are someone with less of a quantitative background, you might find yourself spending more time, trying to make sure that you are staying afloat there. And then it's also gonna depend, I think, on the other things that are happening in your life and work, right? So you trying to maintain that sort of 10 to 15 can be much more challenging in a busy quarter at work, busy quarter with family, things of that nature. And so it will ebb and flow. But I think what ultimately ends up happening is, when you come to Darden, you're given a learning team. That learning team are really it's a group of 5 to 6 individuals who are carefully curated to have as much difference as possible. And the goal of that team, beyond sort of you coming together to go over the cases prior to class, is that team is there also to support you as you see the ebbs and flows, both professionally, academically, and personally.
Yeah, and it's worth noting the calendar for the program. We typically get it sometime in the winter before the start of school, and that will be for the first year of the program, so fall and spring semester. And then January of your first year, you would expect to get the calendar for the remainder of the program. And so, very easy place to kind of start and sort of sit down with people at home and at work around your commitments. And again, you should be carving out in person, online class. It's all required commitments, and sort of setting that expectation early. I think that planning really becomes important. We talk with so many students who sit down with their family members every quarter before each quarter to sort of look at their family calendar, to look at the school calendar, and sort of set that expectation. I'm sure that's happening at work too. Like I don't think I don't think that's limited just to the domestic setting, because I think you need to be clear about these are my weekend residencies. These are when I have online class. How does that intersect with the work that's going on? And so, obviously, the conversation should continue as you approach the start of the program, and absolutely continue while you're in the program. Zoe, what are some things that people can share as they get into the program that could be helpful in their conversations with people at work or people at home?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, like you said, sitting down with that calendar, understanding the time commitments maybe away. So as I mentioned, there's a week long residency. Everybody starts down in Charlottesville. That is a week away from home for many. If you're not local to Charlottesville, even if you are, it's still a week away, and definitely a week away from work. Same thing with the second residency for both programs. So like I mentioned, 18 months in for partial MBA, you'll return to Charlottesville for another week-long residency. That's going to be another week that you're going to sort of be stepping away for this immersive residential experience down in Charlottesville. And then, at the end of the program for executive MBA, that week-long residency away. For executive MBA, another week away is going to be the global residency. Or if you do our global executive MBA, you will be gone for 4 global residencies. So I think those are great places to start. And then particularly for executive MBA, sharing the weekends, those weekend residencies for the first year of the program. We know at least you'll be here 1 weekend a month with distance learning during the week. And then maybe in the second year, when you're in the elective period, those weekends might look a little bit different. You might be here for part of the weekend. You might be here. Maybe you're taking an asynchronous or online class for that quarter. But the point is that I would really highlight the times in which the commitment that you have away for the folks that are in your life.
Yeah, a couple of the things I would mention would be just letting them know about what you're learning in class as well. Sharing what you've been talking about at school, things that you think are really interesting that could be applied in your work, and for the folks at work, and even with your family. Curious about the cases that you're discussing and things that you're learning about. Bring them into the process. I think the more you can bring people into this process, the less threatening it can seem. The more they feel included in it. We do events for partners or significant others where they're included. For example, for executive MBA students, typically in the fall, we'll have a +1 event. The Parts of MBA Student Association, Executive MBA Student Association, they both have events where +1 significant others, partners, spouses are all invited. There's really a culture around this that I think students are certainly encouraged to bring their support network into the experience, and talking about it with people. I think is important. And the other thing I think is important is also to express gratitude as you go through the program. People at work, people at home, just saying thank you as you can, because they are undoubtedly helping you out along the way. And it can be really easy when you get busy to forget about those things. But just saying thank you, I think it goes a long way. And trying to help out where you can and pick up slack where you can. So Zoe, last question. Any additional piece of advice? Anything else you'd encourage folks to think about?
I'm going to reiterate a piece of advice that I think we both gave throughout. And I cannot stress this enough, that having these conversations early and often really makes the difference, I think. And what we know from our current students will tell you that having these conversations early and often made a difference in their application process, made a difference in their ability to enroll in the program, complete the program in a way that they felt supported. And as always, feel free to lean on our team as you navigate some of these conversations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zoe. Great talking with you as always. And thank you so much for all the good insights you shared in this episode.
Happy to be here and happy to help.
And that was my conversation with Zoe Mayfield Boykin, a member of our professional degree admissions team here at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at exec, that's EXEC, MBA at darden.virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.